on the East Coast, and still good morning to those on the West Coast. This is Susan Olson. I'm the VP of Biofuels here at Genscape, and I just want to thank you for joining us today. We're doing a deep dive and how-to seminar on the new QAP rule, this is the fourth of 4 webinars that we've been hosting on RFS2. I'm pleased to have guest speakers with me today, Larry Schaefer and Manny Faraci from Playmaker Strategies, and I'll give a brief introduction to my business associates in just a moment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Genscape is for those of you who maybe are not familiar with what we're doing right now in this space. But we are, we do a lot of things in terms of creating market transparency as a company, and specifically in the biofuel space. There are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. One of the things that we're doing is streamlining environmental credit assurance with remote monitoring, so kind of creating a new method for the audit based on technology. We perform these services for all fuel types across 4 different continents. We've been in the QAP business since the program's inception, and we've helped the industry shape the development and try to do a good job of striking a balance between the different stakeholders as we've gone along. We have a depth in these regulations and renewable fuels technology, both in RFS2 and across the spectrum of renewable fuel types. And we also perform specifically commercial services for LCFS and the California Air Resources Board program and other credit assurance services as well. We're in this for the long haul, so we're really working to bring transparency to the renewable fuels industry and the credits that are included. So I also wanted to let you know that we provide products including Genscape Land Viewer, which is a corn forecasting product, the New York Harbor Ethanol Inventory Report, which is actually a weekly report where we measure the amount of ethanol in storage in New York Harbor. And we also have an ethanol production monitor where we use natural gas nominations as an indicator of production in the ethanol space. So in general, Genscape has a way that we do these things. We're the world's leading provider of real-time monitoring information to help engender better functioning markets, really, for energy and agriculture. So that being said, I wanted to introduce the company. I did want to say this webinar will not be an advertisement. What we're trying to do is create a substantive presentation to help our clients and our future clients better understand this somewhat complex EPA quality assurance plan rule. That being said, I'm very happy with what I do here at Genscape, and we're a great company to work with. We've been awarded the best place to work in Kentucky in a couple of years, and we are, we found that we have a knack for interpreting information for our clients, which is, why we're here today and why we got into this into the QAP business. So, so certainly, if you're on this webinar and not a client, we would love to be working with you and helping you save money in the long run and better comply with the renewable fuels program. So, all that being said, I'll introduce today's speakers. You've heard about myself and my company, and I'm very proud to have with us today Larry Schaefer and Manny Faraci, who are both principals at Playmaker Strategies in Washington, D.C. I've been working with Larry and Manning a while, and I don't think you'll find 2 people in D.C. that have more depth and expertise in the renewable fuels kind of across the board. So they both have more than 20 years experience each in government affairs, and Larry is one of the nation's experts on RFS and kind of helped formulate a lot of that. It was related to biomass-based diesel. He's worked with the Renewable Fuels Association, and he currently provides services to the National Biodiesel Board. Manny has worked in the Chief of Staff's offices in D.C., and so he has some very close ties to how things work in Congress. He has a lot of expertise in taxes and fiscal policy, as well as renewable fuels. He's been done some work for the solar industry and trade associations there as well. So very pleased to have them both with me today, and they'll be talking with you here shortly. So just a couple of logistics to get out of the way. One of the things we really love is we love your questions. So please submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Just so you know, all questions will be treated anonymously, and we'll be answering them at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time to answer all the questions, we'll work to send out a question and answer document after the webinar. So, but we think that helps enrich the webinar and also talk about things that people are interested in. So please don't hesitate to do that. So this is what we'll be talking about today. We're going to do our best to get through this material in approximately 60 minutes and then leave some time for questions and answers, hopefully. So we'll start out talking about the timeline of QAP. So what's the history of this rule? And then we'll talk about qualifying a QAP provider. So if you're going to select a QAP provider, what criteria does that provider need to meet, and things that you should be aware of. And then we'll talk about preparing for QAP. So if you are interested in obtaining QAP services, what are the things that you can be doing now to prepare for that? And then also, we'll give some examples and some details about QAP implementation. So from both the RIN generator and the RIN buyer side of things, you can understand how this process works and how it gives more confidence to the validity of the RIN. So we'll talk about document changes that are specific to this final rule and changes in what can make a RIN invalid downstream and how those rules have changed. And then finally, we'll talk about affirmative defense, RIN invalidity, and QAP authenticity. So one of the things to kind of set the framework before we start with the timeline is, what are the advantages of QAP? So why should you be sorry, somebody just let me know that they're still seeing slide 2. I apologize if that hasn't been switching on your screen. Thank you very much for letting me know about that. So let's go into the advantages of QAP. Before we get started, I'd like to lay the framework. I think everybody likes to think about why they're learning about something and why they're doing something. So what are the benefits of this quality assurance plan? I think the first benefit is that there are no violations for transfer or retirement of invalid RINs with assertion of affirmative defense. So the QAP is one of the criteria for affirmative defense. All 3 RIN types, the types that were established during the, quote, interim period, as well as the QRINs that will be applicable in 2015, ARINs, BRINs, and QRINs all qualify in terms of the QAP requirement for affirmative defense. The other thing that's a big benefit is that with this affirmative defense, penalties can be avoided. So notices of violation and the associated remedial actions, one of the fines that can be levied for an invalid RIN violation, whether transfer or use, can be up to $37,500 per day per violation, and that's stipulated in the Clean Air Act, plus economic benefits or savings that may have occurred from such a violation. You'll remember back in 2012, that there was some settlement agreements related to fraudulent RINs. An example settlement for 4 million invalid RINs was about $350,000. And over and above that, the RINs also had to be replaced with valid RINs. So this was all prior to the QAP program, before there was anything in place that could protect the industry from these violations and from these fines that are associated with those. Also, with QAP, after the RIN fraud, there tended to be market tiers where producers with certain balance sheets, were eligible for, a larger, usually a more beneficial price for the RINs than those with smaller balance sheets in certain situations. And I think that QAP has the power to basically create more equity in the market and also to create more liquidity with RINs so that these things can be transferred and moved more freely with confidence with the QAP backing. And that helps the market mature and helps things become, advance in terms of, the maturity of the commercial market for these RINs. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that, in the past, without QAP and without there being benefits associated with a certain RIN audit process, a lot of times RIN buyers had their own specific process. And so, then you have RIN buyers that are basically going to, each facility and doing their audit. Then you have a second RIN buyer that's doing their version of the audit for that facility. And so, what you can end up with there is kind of a round-robin type of scenario where you've got multiple audits at each generator site for multiple obligated parties and RIN buyers. So I think with QAP, there's a more cost-effective way now set out to do that, where there's a streamlined procedure and benefits associated with that, so that instead of having multiple audits for the same facility, there can be a single audit procedure for that facility that can be performed every quarter and as required by the EPA rules. So, one of the things that we do it was created within the QAP is remote monitoring, which is a real-time safeguard. So, there are things that you have to do, and then there are other ways that you can also do audits. And one of the ways that we perform audits is with remote monitoring. So it has the fastest capability to detect potentially invalid RINs. And really, that doesn't just protect the RIN buyer, but also the RIN generator from large-scale events. So One of the things, Larry, you and I talked about before this is we talked about kind of in terms of within a company, who's responsible for the company submissions and how might QAP help that person? Larry, are you there? You might be on mute. Okay, well, I think Larry is not, he's not on the, I think he may be on mute or maybe having some trouble, so we'll just move on to the next slide here, slide 7. Manning, would you mind walking us through and talking us through this QAP timeline? I know you've been, following this RFS and QAP as it's evolved, so I'll flip it over to you.
Of course, Susan, and let me start by thanking you for having us on the webinar today, and I want to echo what you said. I think that what you have lined up for participants today is a very substantive overview of what is an important and helpful program going forward. And as we were putting this presentation together, and I think it ties in nicely with the previous slide and what Susan was going over previously. It's kind of helpful to have. It is helpful to have the perspective in terms of how this came about in the first place, why there is, why you have quality assurance plans, and why EPA went through the entire rulemaking process. And I'm not going to belabor every little event that happened to this, but it's useful to know just for some perspective. Going back to the genesis, the legislative genesis of the program. So the RFS 2 came into being in December of 2007 when it was when President Bush signed into the law the Energy Independence and Security Act. In July 1st of 2010 is when the RFS 2 regs went into effect. And when you think about the RFS 2 program versus the original RFS program, there was a lot more to it. You had additional categories of fuels that obligated parties had to use and to comply with the program. And part of that newness and that there were some bad actors in the space who engaged in some blatant fraud. Subsequently there were criminal prosecutions and convictions that were associated with those sorts of activities in terms of generating fraudulent RINs in the marketplace. But as you would expect, I mean, from the marketplace perspective, this had the negative impact that Susan alluded to in the previous slide. With you started to really have a detrimental impact in the marketplace in terms of a lack of liquidity, a lack of faith in the RINs of certain providers. This was RIN generators. This was particularly pronounced for some of your smaller producers. But then it's obvious as well as when you have a major program such as the Renewable Fuel Standard, and then there's such high-profile incidences of fraud, Congress is going to take note. The agency is going to take note. In this case, EPA. So in July of 2012, you had some high-profile hearings in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. EPA, leading up to the hearings and even subsequent to the hearings, EPA did a significant amount of outreach to various stakeholders in the program, obligated parties, biofuel generators, mid-market participants, and you had the proposed rule that came out setting up the interim program in February of 2013. And this is laid out nicely on the slide. But that was the impetus behind the program, and the experience. It's worth noting that the experience, once the program was put in an interim level, and you had people that started to engage in the QAP program, several of the problems that they were trying to address with QAP were addressed. It's been Genscape's experience with this that participants in the QAP program in the interim had increased liquidity of their RINs. They actually were able to have RINs move at a premium, and then from a policy perspective, it did help provide cut down on incidences of fraud, particularly in those who engaged in the QAP process. So And as the slide indicates here, and the reason that that we've had these webinars the past couple times here is that we had the final rule that was released on July 2nd, published in the Federal Register on the 18th. So again, just a little bit of background in terms of why we're here, why there is a QAP program, and and the process moving forward. So Susan, you can go to the next slide, please.
Hey, before you move on, Manning, this is Larry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to jump back to the QAP benefit slide, or did you cover that, Susan?
Larry, if you want to just talk, I'll jump back to the slide there, and if you want to just talk for a moment about, talking about the benefits of QAP for RCOs, that'd be great.
I'd be happy to do so. Thank you so much. One of the big things that we saw a lot of back in 2011 and 12 was a lot of apprehension and anxiety at the corporate level about who was responsible and what was going to be the consequences for invalid RINs and for not complying with the Renewable Fuels Program. Under Sarbanes-Oxley and under the corporate structures that many of us have, the RCO, or the responsible corporate officer, is both personally, civilly, and criminally, can be criminally liable for the documents that are signed and submitted to EPA. So this is really serious stuff at the end of the day. Fortunately, folks on the biofuels and petroleum side generally have negotiated quite well through the EPA process of all this in the last couple of years, but I don't know that we can expect that will continue moving forward or not. That being said, a QAP program, and specifically a Genscape QAP program, is really like a good insurance policy. Most of us have an insurance policy on our home, our car, and our life, those types of things, and we should have it, and we hope we never ever have to need it, but it's better to have it than not have it and find out later that something unforeseeable or something bad is going to happen to us today that is going to cost us a lot of money in the future. And under nearly every scenario, mitigation of alleged invalid RINs will be dramatically more expensive than working through a Genscape QAP system. So from not just a financial point of view today, but from a who's responsible later point of view as well. And I think that's one of the big things that companies really need to think about and look at as part of this as well, because at the end of the day, whoever's signing that document that's going over to EPA has a lot of responsibility and risk at place for signing off on the validity of those RINs. So it's a big deal, and the bigger you are as a company, the more important it is for you to have a good mitigation plan in place. Susan, I'll turn it back.
Thanks a lot, Larry. I appreciate that. And Manning, thanks for going through this overview of the QAP timeline. I think both of those kind of set the stage for what we're talking about today. So I also wanted to go through a compliance timeline, kind of from a perspective, if you're retiring RINs, if you're an obligated party, kind of what's been going on historically. So I think after the first RIN fraud was issued, the first notices of violation by the EPA, the EPA responded with an interim enforcement response policy that addressed invalid 2010 and 2011 RINs. Then you had a second interim enforcement response policy that was issued commensurately with the publication of the proposed rule on QAP, which basically established some intent of the EPA to not create notices of violation and those kind of things with RINs that were assured with the interim QAP program. However, there wasn't a complete sense of certainty there, I think, from the industry. So basically the second IERP also included 2014 RINs. With the effective date of the final rule on QAP, the provisions of the second IERP end. So you have the QAPA program start date, which is the next phase of this RIN validity. Basically the QAP program start date is February 20th, and then you have the QRIN program start date, which is the 1st of January, or as soon as the EMTS capabilities are ready for QRINs. Some other important things on this compliance timeline is you're starting to go into the 2013 RIN compliance deadline. The first eligible RIN generation date for retrospective QAP audit provision is 1/1/2013. So all 2013 RINs can be eligible for QAP A or B through the retrospective provision that was finalized in the final rule. the last date on which a retrospective audit can be performed is actually the effective date of the final rule, which is September 18th, 2014. So after that date, the retrospective provision for a QAP auditor won't be available. And then finally, when is the deadline for compliance this year? It's been moved forward a couple of times, and so or moved back a couple of times. So now it's September 30th, 2014, and that's the date for RFS2 compliance for 2013 RINs. So in the next section, Larry and Manning are going to be talking about what are the qualifications of a QAP service provider, and we're presenting this material to you today. So as you're going through thinking that this is something that you're wanting to do for your company to protect your company, what should you look for in the qualifications of a QAP provider? So Larry and Manning, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Susan. And so one of the important components of the program, and again, from just a common sense standpoint, this makes sense, is that if you're going to have a QAP program, then you want to do it in a way where the auditors have true independence, that they don't, so that you are protecting the integrity of the program, and then just as importantly, that the marketplace has faith in the validity of the RINs that are being subjected to the QAP program. So, the slide goes through here and some of the components and requirements that a QAP provider has to meet to participate in the program. And again, some of these are, when you think about it in some level of depth, it actually makes a whole lot of sense. So, a QAP auditor can't be operated by a fuel producer or an obligated party. Has to be free of interest from the renewable fuels producers or obligated parties business. You can't own or trade RINs. One of the interesting things that they added in the final rule that they referenced is that you have to have a situation where there's it is precluded the appearance of any sort of appearance of a conflict of interest. And when you go back and you look in the rulemaking itself in the preamble, they give an example. It's not they don't go through an exhaustive list, but it's more of an illustrative example of what they're getting at here. And the example that they gave, that the agency gave, is that if you had a QAP provider who provide consulting, engineering, in the development and the construction of the facilities when it was being built, and then subsequently was providing QAP services on that facility, that given that they could be, the whole concept of checking the checker could be somewhat undermined if you had that sort of an arrangement. And that's an illustration that they gave in the preamble to the reg itself. But your takeaway here is that the program's requirements, they put in place some pretty robust requirements that a QAP provider be a true independent third party. And as we'll talk about elsewhere in the presentation, there were some requirements that are put on QAP providers, some additional QAP providers requirements to make sure that that was in fact the case. Let's go to the next slide if we can. And again, so when you're looking at a QAP service provider as well, you have, there are certain requirements of QAP auditors. There has to be the oversight of a licensed professional engineer. There has to be a certified and licensed CPA or its equivalent on the team, and the CPA and the engineer can be subcontractors. And the QAP provider has to provide documentation of this when they submit their registration package. So again, all part of an effort in the initiative to make sure that you have true independence and a quality, strong assurance program in place. Larry, I'll turn it over to you for the next slide.
Thanks, Manning. I want to talk a little bit about professional liability insurance, or errors and omission insurance. One of the new requirements, or the solid requirements that EPA put into place, is insisting that auditors have professional liability insurance as part of as part of their responsibility for when they register with EPA. And the reason that they did that is because they think that an insurance company that is standing behind an auditor will require that auditor to be a quality business. You'll require that auditor to be able to do what it says that it is able to do, and show that it has the ability to meet statements basically that they're attesting to. As part of this process, the level of coverage that the auditor has must be disclosed in contracts with the folks that they're providing QAP services to. So it's a big deal. The fact that it's part of the new program means a lot as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. On the registration side, for an auditor has to do a number of things. An auditor is now a regulated party under the program, and an auditor has to follow many of the same rules that other registered parties under the program have to do. They have to submit an affidavit attesting to their independence. They have to have the names and contact info of all the members of their QAP audit review team. They have to have the documentation of a professional engineer and their CPA affiliations. Remember, under this program, they have to have as part of their team a professional engineer and a CPA as part of their team. They don't have to go do every audit or every step of the process, but they have to approve the audit process that happens through this process as well. They have to have documentation of their insurance plan, their E&O plan, and they also have to provide a list to EPA of the renewable fuel producers that they intend to engage in QAP services for the year. And finally, at the end of the day, they have to be qualified to approve a QAP plan which fits the fuel, the feedstock, and the process for which they are auditing as well. So an auditor will have a bushel basket full of things that they will take to EPA on an annualized basis. EPA will have to approve that auditor to be to be a qualified QAP auditor. Next slide, please. And if you are in the field and you're not a QAP auditor, but you want to know what is going on with auditors, then you can go to the EPA website. They have a list of pre-registered QAP providers between September 18th and December 31. You can request registration materials from QAP providers and/or contact the EPA to get that information as well. And then after December 31, starting on January 1, RINs will be designated on the EMTS system and associated with QAP providers and the EPA assigned ID number. So what EPA is trying to do is be very transparent about what QAP auditors are able to do, which QAP services they're able to provide, and move forward accordingly. So this is all a pretty solid thing for independence and transparency that the marketplace has been asking for. So I think EPA has done a pretty good job on highlighting the specific steps that are available, and you as companies have access to that information as well. Susan, next slide.
Thanks, you guys. That was a very informative, and I think that kind of hits the qualifications of QAP very well. So, part of the point of this presentation was really to help a RIN generator and also anybody in the transferee chain all the way to the obligated party prepare for what they might need to do or how to basically on how to approach QAP. So for the RIN generator, we built this slide and kind of we're going to go through some additional detail here. If you're a RIN generator and you're selecting your QAP provider, these are the steps that we thought of that are really key to go through. The first is to qualify and select your QAP provider. And you can see the slides on the discussion that Manning and Larry just gave on the QAP auditor qualifications. The other thing that I always talk to our clients, and now we're talking to a lot of prospective clients about, is talk to your counterparties about QAP assurance. There may be specific QAP service provider qualifications that they have, and what types of qualifications will be accepted. Something that we're finding is that some RIN buyers give preferential treatment to QAP RINs. So that's something that you're going to want to talk to your counterparties about. So, those are the two main suggestions under that beginning part of the process. As you're going into QAP, something that we find among our operations team here at Genscape is that there are some things that typically maybe have lapsed and not been updated. So it's a good time to do this now before you get into the QAP, because a lot of these are in parts of checkpoints that have to be done to meet the QAP qualification. So the first one is, make sure that your responsible corporate officer is up to date. Check to make sure your company name is up to date. If your company has changed ownership or names, the address, capacity, feedstocks, all those good items that are in the CDX, make sure that those are up to date. If you've had some processing changes, so you're actually doing something different to produce renewable fuel, those may require an engineering review update. So you can always just make your QAP provider aware of that. Like, for instance, when we go out to a site, we can do engineering services commensurate with our site visit. So that's something that we could do at the same time if you're in that situation. The other thing we recommend is creating an electronic signature association. There will be some associations that you're going to need to make in EMTS with your QAP provider, and if you have an ESA in place, it just makes that go a lot more quickly. So, and then the third and fourth things, once you start a QAP program, assemble your baseline documentation package, and we'll basically get to exactly what that is here in the next couple of slides. And then also, you'll need to start including quarterly data reporting in your workflow, which really is not going to be over and above most things that you're already doing, but it is something that you need to be aware of, and start meeting with your team to prepare for that quarterly workflow. So yeah, I just want to make you aware that the final rule is September 18th, and there's a little more than 90 days left between September 18th and when QRINs go live. So that's actually a pretty short time to start a new process within your facility if you're not already doing QAP. So, we're really encouraging people to get on top of this and start to act now so that you're prepared when that January date comes. So this kind of goes through Genscape's QAP onboarding process, just as an example of what you can expect. So as soon as you sign a master services agreement with us, we basically have a welcome to Genscape QAP. We provide the checklist and workflow that you'll need to start going through the process. The next steps are scheduling. We have RIN training that's included as part of our service, and then we also will do your first annual site visit. We initialize you on the dashboard as well. That's something that Genscape has as a web-based system basically for promoting its clients and connecting them to RIN buyers. So kind of going through the top part that appeared there, once your RIN training is complete, we have to acquire a quality sample as part of QAP and complete the first site audit. Then we'll basically review all that material, and if there is something that is off, we basically give you a remediation procedure to get things back on track. And so once that's all passed, that's one leg of the thing. That's one leg of the QAP processes that has to happen before you become QAP verified. The second thing that we do is basically the baseline producer information set. So we collect this documentation set, do the review. Again, if there is some remediation that needs to be done, we walk you through that. Once that's completed, then you are officially QAP verified. And then on a go-forward basis, we use remote monitoring, and so we basically submit that plan to the producer facility. We then come in and monitor the equipment with cooperation with the facility. The other thing that we do is obtain read-only access and basically do some training on how to get the quarterly documentation sets that are needed. And once those things are completed, then the ongoing QAP is in place. So I'm not going to go through all these things individually, but what we wanted to do here is basically give the webinar attendees a takeaway on the checklist of common things that are required for preparing for QAP. This is the onboarding documentation list that's typically needed. Now, not all these things are applicable to every producer. For instance, if you don't collect your own feedstock, there are no feedstock collection logs. And for a biogas producer, for instance, there aren't. You're probably not going to have feedstock invoices. So these things are just common items. It's a pretty comprehensive list of the things that we collect as part of the onboarding documentation. And then similarly, there are quarterly document submissions that must occur as part of this QAP process. We for these pieces of documentation to come to us, so that's something that tends to make things pretty convenient. So to support a mass balance and feedstock checks, there's a list of the documents that are typically required, and some of this is actually data, so numbers representing how much renewable fuel is produced, for instance, and being able to match that up on what actually comes into the facility. Then we take samples of other documentation, again, meter tickets or data, inbound and outbound shipment records, those are examples. And then a complete documentation set we require things like utility bills to support that the facility was actually using, natural gas or electricity or water in the case of, say, a biodiesel water wash facility. And there are certain other things that are required as part of the QAP requirements. And then on a per event basis, facility infrastructure changes, feedstock and processing changes, those type of things we need to be aware of as they occur. And then some rare things like if a facility intends to process off-spec fuel. So this is a pretty good list. QAP data analysis occasionally can trigger the need for additional information, but this is something to take away for the webinar attendees to kind of help prepare for that quarterly workflow. So I want to talk a little bit about what to expect when you're in a QAP program. So QAP basically consists of a few different elements. One of them is what we call facility audit, which is basically the facility site visit. Then we obtain data from our clients. We then perform remote monitoring in the stead of actually doing a second site visit during the year. And then we also perform the RIN verification element, which is actually accessing EMTS data in a read-only fashion to compare to the amount of renewable fuel produced. We do analysis combining all these data parts, and basically then if there are any issues, we work with our clients through remediation. And then we display the results of the QAP on our dashboard so that it's easy to promote our clients and connect them with those that want to learn about which facilities are QAP verified and what their status is. So to kind of talk a little bit about the site visit. So what to expect when the auditor comes on site. One of the things you can expect is that they'll want to walk through with operations personnel through the facility from the beginning to the end, and also through any laboratory facilities that are there. You can expect the auditor to acquire pictures and take photographs of things like key processing equipment. There may be interviews with personnel about processing operations. For convenience, we sometimes collect documentation on site. The auditor can also acquire about feedstock sourcing, transportation, where the fuel is delivered, how that happens, and then as required by the EPA, the auditor will collect a fuel sample, and for some facilities, a feedstock sample for laboratory testing. So, and as part of our QAP process, we discuss and plan the remote auditing options with the operations staff. One thing to note is that through a QAP program, a triennial RFS2 required engineering review may also be performed at the same time as a QAP site visit, as long as it's with a licensed professional engineer that's recognized through our RFS2 standards. We've got a lot of questions about biogas recently, and we've completed several QAP audits for biogas facilities already. So ongoing remote monitoring is easily incorporated at these facilities, and renewable electricity will be very similar. So I wanted to provide here a document set specifically for biogas, because a lot of people have questions about what's required for that. The site visit is actually very similar to what's there for liquid fuels. Obviously the processing equipment is different, but generally it's a tour of the landfill or digester, then looking at the equipment that processes the landfill gas or digester gas to actually pipeline quality gas. And then basically the auditor needs to be able to review the site all the way up to the point at which high MMBTU gas enters the pipeline. And that's the requirement basically from the EPA standard. So, and this gives you an idea of what types of onboarding data collection. The quarterly data collection that we mentioned in the previous list is actually quite similar. And so then I wanted to talk a little bit about Genscape's integrity and sustainability monitoring capabilities. All the remote monitoring that we do at facilities is typically, customized to a particular facility. We have a very non-intrusive monitoring methods that, that are not things that you put into pipes or necessarily into tanks and things like that. Most of the sensing that we use now is actually quite benign and passive. So I think that most of our client base has been been very satisfied with this method of remote monitoring. And we actually are looking in the future on how we can take this data and then present it in a way that may be useful in addition to facilities' own PLC systems. So, with that being said, here's kind of our toolbox. So, we basically have capabilities to do from the very beginning land use change analysis. And then we also, have methods to look at feedstock receipt monitoring. And these are for, instances where you're actually getting something trucked in or barged in or railed in. Again, not for biogas or renewable electricity. We use pump monitors and IR heat signatures for processing and energy monitoring. We also look at fuel output. We have IR tank levels that can gauge how much is going into the tank or coming out of the tank. We use pump sensors for this to be able to measure, how much electricity a pump is using. And then we use tank level meter data as well. So for transportation and destination, and this also comes into play with LCFS as well as RFS2, but we have a secure way to receive rail data. We also can do unit train tracking, and then we use imaging where it's needed to basically identify transportation from rail, truck, and barge. So Larry, kind of getting back to the first point here about land use change, I know you had some comments about feedstock and aggregate compliance in the 2007 date.
Yeah, and really, I just had a question for you, Susan.
Sure.
It seems like under the RFS that agricultural feedstock is required to be planted on land that was in agricultural use on or before December 19th of 2007. So when you're looking at the renewable biomass definition, your feedstock, if you're in the world of agriculture, has to be planted on or before December 19th of 2007 when the law was signed into law back in 2007. You talk about land use change analysis and those types of things. Does your system help track and help people comply with that aspect of things, or are you talking about something different in that aspect of things?
No, that's precisely it, Larry. Great question. Yes, and we do have the databases that have the imagery that's prior to and right up to 2007 and the current date. So we've done this type of analysis. We have actually have a tool that we created for the International Sustainability and Carbon Council, basically to be able to go through and compare this on a site-by-site basis here in the States, and then we also have similar tools to do that abroad. So we've done several projects across the world where we've analyzed land use change for that specific marker, that 2007 marker.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Well, I think the next piece, again, I'm going to pitch it back to Manning and Larry to talk about, how the QAP rule talks about documentation changes such as product transfer documents and the downstream invalidation. Actually, Larry will hit the first slide here, and then I have some specifics to talk through on product transfer documents.
Yes, thank you, Susan. So a big section of the renewable or the QAP program has to do with your product transfer documents and what happens to your fuel or what happens to fuel generally when it's moved downstream. Historically, there have been some big questions that EPA has had and that the marketplace has had about when does fuel become invalid because it's used for something different than what it was intended for, and it's really difficult to track what happens in the marketplace after one makes that first sale. So what EPA proposed and finalized as part of this program is that if you're using denatured ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel that meets ASTM 975-3A, grade number 1D or number 2D, those three fuels, are highly likely to be used as transportation fuel, heating oil, or jet fuel. And those are the uses that are specifically highlighted by the legislation and the regulation. And if you're using denatured ethanol, biodiesel, or this specific renewable diesel, then you are not subject to additional documentation requirements. If you're not using one of those three fuels, which is largely most of the biofuels that are in the marketplace today, right? We've got over 13 billion gallons of ethanol. We've got somewhere between 1.3 and 2 billion gallons of biodiesel in the marketplace and renewable diesel in the marketplace as well. So most of the fuels that are out there will fit into that category. But if you have something other than those three, then EPA has limited the opportunity for RIN generation to circumstances where the RIN generator, the company who is generating the RIN, has taken actions to ensure that the fuel is used for transportation fuel, heating oil, or jet fuel. Or in other words, to simplify that a little bit, if you're putting a fuel into the marketplace, your intention has to be that it's going to be used for transportation fuel, heating oil, or jet fuel. And I'm going to turn it back to Susan, and she's going to walk through a little bit about what the specific documentation is supposed to look like based upon the QAP rule.
Larry, yeah, this feeds right into your comments there. I think that the EPA had kind of deliberated on several things and to change in product transfer documents, but there was one change, and only one change that I'm aware of that they came up with, which was in part to, again, emphasize the downstream use, and then also to emphasize that any person exporting the fuel is actually subject to requirements of 40 CFR 80.1430. So basically, the next three slides, kind of what's been created here is basically it's a table that shows, first the top block here of text actually shows, that this is the text that needs to be put on a product transfer document. It's actually different for different fuel types. So in the next three slides, what we've done is actually created a table that, in the text A block here, so you would go and you would look and see, well, what fuel type am I? And let's say that I'm ethanol. So, then basically I would look for text A in the column here, and what goes in to insert where I just circled in text A is neat or blended ethanol. So in some cases, like for renewable heating oil, it doesn't specify particularly blended, but heating oil is generally heating oil. So, and then also the downstream use piece is called out as part of the text that needs to be used. So basically that is the text B here, and it dictates whether something can be just transportation fuel or whether it's transportation fuel and jet fuel, or also includes heating oil. And so, there are different specifications for those texts there. So what we're trying to do here is to kind of create an option where, or create a resource for people that are on the webinar here that could, kind of take this away and, look at this for reference as they're creating changes to product transfer documents. There's also specific things for naphtha and butanol, and then for any other renewable fuel that's not specifically mentioned, this is the text that you use. So I wanted to let everybody on the call know that the effective date of the final rule is September 18, 2014. So product transfer documents should reflect these new statements by that time. And there's certainly nothing from stopping you from including this on your product transfer documents at an earlier time so you get it in as part of your process. So Larry, I'll flip it back to you to talk a little bit about the export RVO requirements and how that's changed.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Again, another one of the big issues that EPA is trying, or was trying to help minimize some of the distraction on, really had to do with the export of biofuels in the marketplace. There's some loose accounting and other things that were going on as it relates to when companies would export biofuels either as a blended product or as a neat product. So. What EPA did is they tightened up the requirement, if you will, for an exporter, and it's known as the exporter RVO requirements. So exporters have three ways of determining how much renewable fuel is subject to the exporter RVO. And the type of renewable fuel that is blend, and the blend level may be specified in documents provided by the seller, usually in the form of a production transfer document. So in other words, if you are receiving a product from someone in the chain, from a seller, they can tell you specifically what the volume is of the renewable fuel in the product, and you then, when you are exporting it, you have to retire and create an export RVO in that amount. Another way that you could do it is there's an ASTM test. The ASTM test is 6866, which tests the renewable volume or the renewable content of renewable fuel in fuel as well. So if you use one of those two methods, you specifically know what the volume of the renewable fuel is, and then as an exporter, you would create an export RVO and you would retire a RIN based upon what those volume amounts are. If you're not using either of those methods, then what EPA is requiring you to do is they're requiring you to assume that the fuel contains the maximum concentration of renewable fuel allowed by law or regulation. Today, diesel fuel that is not labeled has an allowance of up to 5% biodiesel in it. So under that scenario, if you don't specifically know the volume amount, or if you don't test it specifically, then you're going to have to assume a volume of 5% on your export. If the fuel that you're exporting is in the 6 to 20% category, the 5.1 to 20% category. If you don't know the specific volume, let's say that it's B14 or B17 or B11 or whatever it might be. If you're not told specifically what it is through a product transfer document, or if you don't do an ASTM test on it, then you are required to assume that it's going to be B20 on the export as well. So this is important information because it tells those folks who are exporting fuels in the marketplace exactly how they're supposed to treat an export moving forward. The other part of this that is important is retirement of those exported RINs for fulfilling the exporter's RVO is now required after September 18th to be done in 30 days from the date of export. And that's a change in the rule from what it was historically. And the other change in the rule is that there used to be a deficit carryover allowance provision for exporters, and that provision has been eliminated. So we don't have that provision anymore either. The next slide. An exporter RVO may be avoided if RINs have not been generated for the exported fuel. So if I'm a biofuel producer and I know that I'm going to be or that somebody is going to be exporting the fuel that I make, and I never ever generate a RIN on it, then whoever is exporting the product is not required to generate an export RVO on that either. An affidavit is required to be maintained by the exporter to avoid the RVO for exported fuel for which RINs have not been generated. So whoever is making the transaction from seller to exporter, there's going to have to be an affidavit in place that shows exactly what that transaction is as well. There was also a little bit of a question mark about, well, maybe the company that I bought it from had previously retired the RIN before it got to me, and EPA basically said on that issue, they said, you know, we can't imagine that scenario ever happening. So we're going to limit the retirement or the ability to eliminate the retirement only in cases where RINs have been generated or have not been generated on the exported fuel. So again, it's tighter requirements than what we've had before, a little bit stricter application of the rule, and it's simply to get at making sure that we know under the rules and under the application how renewable fuels are going to be treated for purposes of the exporter RVO. Susan?
They were very specific about that, weren't they, Larry, in terms of, hey, you know, it does have to be the generator that actually retires those RINs. So I mean, that was a very specific part of the rule.
And the other part about it, just generally speaking, and in working with lots and lots of biofuel producers and obligated parties, most folks generally agreed with the program that EPA proposed and finalized. There was some discussion about whether or not it should be 5 days or 30 days or 60 days or, you know, a quarter, whatever it might be. But most parties in the transaction arena agreed that those rules should be tighter. So I think most of us on the call today should welcome this part of the rules. You just need to understand what they are and how they work and what your options are if you are exporting biofuels.
Sure, absolutely. And you know, one of the things that we typically provide, and I know I've actually had a couple of questions today about templates, and you know, one of the things that we do as part of our service is actually, we serve as a compliance resource for our clients. So it's not something that we're not consultants, and we, you know, don't charge any fees for that. It's just part of what we do for our clients. So, you know, things like we provide are, you know, samples of what kind of, you know, samples of affidavits that you might use, things that we have, you know, provided for clients in the past when they've had to provide affidavits for the EPA, so they're used to seeing these types of formats. So this is just a sample affidavit text. Certainly, you know, use your own resources and your own company's judgment to construct what is right for you to attest to, but this kind of gives an idea of the elements that you might include for this affidavit required for exporters not to incur an RVO. So now I'm going to flip it back over to Larry and Manning to talk about some aspects not from the generation side, but from the actual provisions of the rule and how they deal with invalid RINs and the provisions for affirmative defense. So Larry and Manning, I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susan. And you know, the affirmative defense component it's obviously it's a huge component of the program in terms of making it work and providing an incentive to participate or consider a QAP option. So we thought it would be useful to go through in a greater level of detail, some of the specifics about the affirmative defense provisions that were in the final rule. And as you can see here, here's kind of an outline of some of the things that we're going to cover. Some information specifically about the affirmative defense, but then some other specific questions about notification requirements about a potentially invalid RIN, and then some information about the limited exemption that's provided for in the rulemaking as well. Susan, if we could go to the next slide, please. So let's start with, in what invalid RINs are eligible for affirmative defense, and what are the criteria for it? And I think that, just for future reference, and this deck is going to be made available to participants afterwards, I think that this is a good reference for people to take a look at here. And in general, consistent with the rulemaking and the existing regs, if you have a situation where a QAP RIN was created or transferred to any person and then it's subsequently invalid, or a QAP RIN was used to meet an RVO. And then in the box to the right here, you have some specific examples of the types of situations where affirmative defense could apply. Susan, can we go to the next slide, please? So, then you have this, applicability here. So when can affirmative defense be relied upon? And again, this is pretty straightforward, but worth mentioning. And we still get questions about this where, remember at the high level that the QAP program is voluntary. You still have the buyer beware system that is out there underlying the RFS program. The rulemaking is explicit in that regard. So if affirmative defense is something that is a risk mitigation strategy or is a marketing strategy from either the producer of a RIN generator's perspective or from an obligated party's perspective, it has to be a QAP RIN to afford itself the benefits of having affirmative defense. And then, as you can see here, there's some other, you've got some other, situations that you need to consider as it applies to affirmative defense. For example, affirmative defense is not applicable to RIN generators, and in the rulemaking itself, they go through and the agency provides its rationale for why that's the case, because apparently they obviously did receive some comments during the rulemaking suggesting that it should apply to RIN generators, but it doesn't. Can we go to the next document, next slide, please? So, what is required to assert affirmative defense? And this is, this is really, this is an important point. And in Section 80.1473 of the regulation, there are 6 criteria, and there's an ordering to these criteria that the agency lays out in terms of what you have to do to be able to rely on affirmative defense in a situation where you have a QRIN that is subsequently deemed to be invalid. And some of these are common sense, but it's just kind of good to go through them. Number one, the RINs in question had to be verified by an EPA-approved QAP plant provider. Number two, the RIN owner had no reason to believe that the RINs that they were invalidly generated at the time that they either transferred them or used them for compliance purposes. A QAP provider or a RIN owner is required to inform EPA when they suspect that they may have a invalidly generated RIN. Now, initially in the proposed rule, that was a 1-day requirement. They lengthened that to 5 days. So a slight change there. Again, this was kind of common sense, but the RIN owner didn't cause the invalidity. Number 5, a RIN owner doesn't have a financial interest in the company that generated the invalid RIN. And then there's a requirement that the RIN owner properly adjusts its records, reports, and compliance calculations in which the invalid RIN was required by regulation. So, there are very specific criteria that they lay out. Wisdom would dictate that it's probably worthwhile that if you are in a situation where you're going to rely on affirmative defense, that it would be worthwhile to consult with counsel and just dot all the I's, cross all the T's to make sure that you're doing what you need to do to be able to rely on that affirmative defense. But we thought it was worth mentioning here, just what these components of are and what these requirements are in terms of affirmative defense, because it is such a integral component of the program. If we could go to the next slide, please. And Larry, I will turn this one over to you.
Okay, thanks, Manning. And I'm just going to reiterate a little bit about what Manning just said about the last slide. It's important internally, if you want to avail yourself of that affirmative defense, that you understand the elements of what you need to do to assert the affirmative defense. If you miss one of those 6 elements that Manning just talked about, then you are not eligible for the affirmative defense. So your legal team, your internal team at your company will want to understand what that looks like. You'll want to put a good flow chart together internally so that if something happens, that you can mitigate and make sure that the affirmative defense applies to you. So on this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about potentially invalid RINs and notification of those potentially invalid RINs. And very simply, a potentially invalid RIN is a RIN that someone thinks it may be invalid, but hasn't yet quite proven that it is or hasn't quite established that it is. So the first question is, who can designate a potentially invalid RIN? Well, a RIN generator could do it, a QAP auditor could do it, or EPA could do it. And depending on which one of those 3 you are, there are different procedures and corrective actions that you would take. A RIN generator that self-identifies a potentially invalid RIN must retire the potentially invalid RIN or a valid RIN within 30 days. So if you know of a potentially invalid RIN, either that RIN or a valid RIN has to be retired within 30 days. Let's walk down to the gray boxes, and we'll kind of walk from left to right across the screen. If EPA reports a potentially invalid RIN to a RIN generator, then the RIN generator retires that potentially invalid RIN or a valid RIN within 30 days, like we just talked about. Or a RIN generator makes a demonstration to EPA that the RIN is valid within 30 days. So if the RIN generator actually thinks that the PIR or the potentially invalid RIN is actually valid, then you need to demonstrate to EPA why it's valid. EPA will then make a determination that RINs are valid, or EPA will make a determination that RINs are invalid. If they are invalid, then a retirement obligation applies. Okay, let's move down to the green boxes. A QAP auditor must report to EPA and RIN generator within 5 days of becoming aware of information that there is a potentially invalid RIN. Under the proposal, I think they had talked about notifying folks within 1 day. EPA recognized that a 1-day notification is virtually impossible in some cases, where you might find this potentially invalid RIN on a Friday or on a weekend or holidays, whatever it might be. So they opened the window to a 5-day window, just simply because what you might think is invalid on 1 day may actually be valid after a little bit of investigation, or vice versa. So they want to give folks a chance to be accurate about it. So they've opened that window to 5 days, which is eminently reasonable. A RIN generator retires that potentially invalid RIN or a valid RIN within 30 days if you're notified of a potentially invalid RIN. Or the RIN generator has to make a demonstration to the QAP auditor that the RIN was actually valid rather than invalid within a 30-day time frame. The QAP auditor then, for the determination, will determine that the RINs are valid, or that EPA has final say on whether or not that RIN is valid, or the QAP auditor will determine that RINs are invalid, and again, EPA will have a final say on that notification as well. Let's go to the next slide. Limited exemption. Obligated parties are offered a 2% limited exemption for invalid B RINs and Q RINs for 2013, 14, 15, and 16. If an obligated party is required to retire or replace invalid Q RINs or B RINs, the amount of the limited exemption is excused for a particular calendar year. For B RINs, the limited exemption is 2% of the RVO by fuel type for calendar years 2013 and 14 during the interim period. There's an annual exemption calculated at 2% of the RVO by fuel type, by cellulosic, by biomass-based diesel, by advanced biofuel, and by renewable fuel. So if you are an obligated party, you have the option for a limited exemption as part of the program as well, and that obligated exemption, that limited exemption is good for the years 2013, 14, 15, and 16. So you want to be familiar with that 2% limited exemption section as well. Susan, I think we're going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Larry, and that's a great section, guys. I appreciate you talking through the affirmative defense and the RIN invalidity and how that works. I think the mechanics of that are important to understand. Always hopefully those things don't happen, but as your insurance reference went before, in case those things do happen, it's great to have these protections in place. So we've gotten a lot of questions. Just a quick comment here. I know we're at about 6 after the hour, so just so you know, we're just a few slides away from wrapping it up. We'll probably take one or two of the few questions and then bring this thing to a close. Most of you have already gotten the slides. If you sign up a little later, then you will be getting the final copy afterwards, so that will be coming your way. The questions that we don't answer at the end, we will be sending out questions and answers, probably actually for the ones we do answer as well. That's the way that we typically do it. So if you need to go, we certainly understand your time is valuable, so feel free to, but we'll be wrapping up here in just a few moments. So one of the things that we often get asked is, what about this interim period? So it's called an interim period, the A RINs and B RINs, and the interim period lasts from February 21st, 2013 to January 1st, 2015, when the Q RIN program will be established. Now, retrospective audits can actually go back to January 1st, 2013 and are recognized by the final rule, and that applies to A RINs and B RINs. So A RINs and B RINs will be official come September 18th, 2014, when the final rule is effective. So these things are official. Affirmative defense is good with A RINs and B RINs. One of the questions we often get is, well, how do I know that a RIN is an A RIN or B RIN? Or as a matter of fact, one of the questions that came across in our question box here is, how do I know a producer is QAPA or QAPB producer, or for that matter, a Q RIN producer? So really, Q RINs will be flagged in EMTS. So you'll see them when you receive a transaction. However, it's not like eBay where you can go and search and say, okay, I want all the Q RIN producers. So that information really, you'll need to be getting from QAP providers. And we actually provide several tools for RIN holders and obligated parties to validate their A RINs and B RINs, and these are available actually for the compliance deadline, which I got some news from somebody on the call today that may have actually been moved forward again. So do check on that. The compliance deadline, as we were aware of it this morning, was still September 30th, 2014, but that again may have changed. So, but
Susan, this is Larry. I'll just jump in on it. There is going to be an announcement today. It's pending, and I think you'll see it on EPA's website. Probably around 5 o'clock today, that basically says we're still working on the 2014 RVO. We don't know when it's going to be finalized, but we're going to give obligated parties 30 days after that final rule is published in the Federal Register for compliance purposes. So that sounds like that's going to be later than September 30th. So let's say that it's published on September 10th, then you would have until October 10th, if you will, or October 9th, whichever is 30 days after that. So that's what they announced or will be announcing today.
Yeah, I got, you're right. Actually, I love this real-time feedback. I've got confirmation that it actually has posted on the EPA website. So we'll be delayed, so check that out. Thanks for chiming in on that, Larry. So just so you know, again, still very, very important, especially as this compliance deadline gets delayed, and you don't want to lose track of how can you take advantage of the A RINs and B RINs for your compliance. So we provide 3 very clear methods for RIN holders and obligated parties to validate A RINs and B RINs. The first is our Biofuels dashboard, which I'm going to go into in depth, how to get access to that. The second is assurance certificates. So we provide those on demand to producers as well as RIN buyers. We'll provide a certificate that covers batches, producers, all the necessary primary key information to assure those RINs. And the other thing that we do that obligated parties are starting to take advantage of is if you send us a list of RINs, that are related to that your compliance, and you want us to check those for RIN compliance, we'll provide you, basically a verification of those RINs as QAP A and B validated. So feel free to contact us about that. I think it's a very efficient and effective way to take care of compliance and to minimize your risk going forward. So again, I'll do a little bit of a deep dive into using Genscape's Biofuels dashboard. So we've created a web-based platform to basically show a real-time view of QAP verification, and this is going to be available for A, B, and Q. So the nice thing about this is you don't have to wait until you get a transaction in EMTS to figure out if a RIN is a Q RIN or not. You can actually look at a real-time status of our clients on the dashboard. So we provide a lot of information, a facility profile, images, the last time an engineering review was performed, a lot of metadata about the clients, but right here up front, the compliance status and what sort of RINs that the facility has produced, B RINs, A RINs, Q RINs, or none. It's pretty easy. The link below should work in the PDF that you get. So just go to the link and create a free account. You enter this data, and basically, if you're interested in other services, you can also click to find out more about those. Once you create your account, you'll see a screen that pops up that says check your email, and you'll get an email with, typically just like if you register for any type of service, you'll get a link. You'll have to verify that you got the email through that link, and then you'll have your login and your password, and you can use that at any time. We only allow real-time QAP verification to be viewed by RIN buyers. So Genscape will contact RIN buyer registrants about that. If you don't receive a call from us, please call or email our Genscape customer care if you have any questions. So just to finalize, we do provide these compliance services. We provide QAP services for all fuel types, all pathways, and all countries of origin for both renewable fuel producers and importers. We have a lot of experience with the vast array of fuel types. We do the remote monitoring method that's talked about in the QAP. One of the reasons why we do this is because it enables faster detection of any potential compliance issues, which we think is a pretty big advantage for both the generator and the RIN buyer. We also perform LCFS integrity audits. That's a program through the California Air Resources Board. And one of the great things is that LCFS audits and QAP audits can be performed at the same time and in tandem, so there's low incremental cost for adding this audit or other types of compliance audits with QAP. And then just finally, talking about kind of what are the advantages of this remote monitoring and the Genscape method of QAP. So one thing about the remote monitoring is it actually replaces the second annual site visit. So it enables multiple compliant needs at once and reduces what we've heard to be called as audit fatigue. So we try to help minimize that kind of fatigue whenever we can. We're very cost competitive with other QAP programs that are out there, and we provide the maximum value and least risk with the real-time type of information. We have a substantial and established E&O, which will be disclosed in all the contracts and MSAs we have with our clients. We also have created this used web-based dashboard that I showed you for data drop-off and also to promote our clients and to provide a place for the community to come and find out more about renewable fuel producers that are in the industry. We provide on-demand compliance service. We talked a little bit about that earlier. It's just part of our service. And we also can do on-demand RIN generation training as part of your services with QAP with Genscape if that's something that you would like. So just finally, we would encourage those of you that aren't part of a QAP program right now, we're recommending that you enroll by October 1st to prepare for January Q RINs. And the reason is that this is a new process to many RIN generator and producer clients. So we want to encourage adequate time to get the process rolling, to build it into your workflow, and make sure if there are any small remediation items like CDX updates and those kind of things that you allow time to do that. So, and of course, there are some familiar holidays in the fall and the winter that we all enjoy. So, those are going to happen, here coming up within the next 120 days, and want people to be thinking about that and be aware of that. So generally, we would encourage people to get started on the QAP process. So here's our contact information. certainly thank you today for being part of this webinar, and hope that we provided some valuable information and a takeaway, with the slide deck that we'll be sending out. Most of you've already gotten the version that was sent out before the presentation. So in the sake of time, it's 3:15, so we'll take a couple of questions. So one of the questions, and I will say that I'm going to have to do some research on this, but I'll throw this out here for my colleagues in case that they have information about this. The question was, in addition to the new designations on the product transfer documents for transportation, heating oil, or jet fuel, does a renewable fuel producer still have to include the designate and track provisions from the ultra-low sulfur diesel program?
I think the answer is yes to that. I didn't see that had specifically changed, and I agree we'll have to do a little bit more research on it, but I would continue to do that unless you hear otherwise.
Makes sense. So another question, and I think we addressed it, is there currently a list of RIN generators that are participating and certified in the QAPA and QAPB programs? And I think that, I think client lists are still proprietary with the QAP provider, but certainly we make those lists readily available to RIN buyers, so please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to give you the list of the clients that are participating and promote those clients as QAP verified. I think that was pretty much it. There were some very technical questions here, and again, we'll get back and answer those with our follow-up Q&A. Manny and Larry, I just want to thank you both for being a part of this today. Any final comments for our attendees today?
No, in the interest of time, we'll close out.
No, Susan,
okay.